Because if you have a central government without a press, Jefferson was afraid that that government would actually do the same bad things that Adams was concerned about in France. And so this was the debate at the dawn of the new Constitution, which was finally adopted in 1789. And the compromise that was struck between the people who agreed with John Adams and the people who agreed with Thomas Jefferson, the compromise was it would be a strong constitution that created a strong central government. But, and this was crucial, there would be a Bill of Rights that would guarantee freedom of various sorts for the American people. Freedom, that is, that the government, restricted by these rights, would not be able to abridge. And in fact, there were 12 amendments that were originally proposed. Only 10 were ratified. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press was not the 10th, the 9th, the 8th. It wasn't even the Second Amendment. It was the First Amendment to the Constitution. First as in foremost, first as in most important. And this First Amendment protected freedom of religion, freedom of people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances, and it protected freedom of speech and the press, as I mentioned. Well, this amendment and the other 10 amendments were ratified in 1791. In 1796, John Adams became the second president of the United States. In 1798, Congress passed the Sedition Act. This was 7 years, 1798, after the First Amendment had been adopted. And the Sedition Act, amazingly, said anyone who was critical of the government, disrespectful of the government, disrespectful of the president, any one of those things could be found guilty of violating this act and could be fined thousands of dollars and sentenced to years in prison. As a matter of fact, this was coupled with something called the Alien Act, which wasn't about aliens in outer space, it was about aliens in different countries. And coupled together, a person who published material that was critical of the government could have been tried for treason and executed. 7 years after the adoption of the First Amendment. And to give you an idea about how bad things were then, shortly after the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, John Adams was traveling from Philadelphia, which was then the capital of the United States, back to his home in Braintree, Massachusetts. Great name, isn't it? Braintree, Massachusetts. Anyway, he happened to be traveling through Newark, New Jersey. And Newark, New Jersey was pretty much then what it is now. It wasn't exactly a teeming cultural citadel. And people there like to drink a lot. There's nothing wrong with that. They were actually trying to be respectful of the president. And in those days, when the president would pass through town, the towns would fire cannons as a sign of respect for the president. But somehow these people in Newark were a little behind the 8 ball, and John Adams had passed through town, he was gone, and they started firing the cannons. Sounds like what we do in the communications department sometimes. Anyway, someone with a group of his friends mumbled, "Why are they firing the cannons now? John Adams is gone. They're firing the cannons at his ass." And that is a direct quote. They're firing the cannons at his ass. Well, a friend of his, a town drunkard, I looked this up, a town drunkard by the name of Luther Baldwin basically responded, "I wish they'd fire the cannon through John Adams' ass." Well, unfortunately for Mr. Baldwin, standing nearby were a couple of Federalists, that is, people who were part of John Adams' party. And they promptly called over some constables and had Baldwin arrested for being disrespectful and threatening of the president. I guess disrespectful because he uttered the word ass, threatening because of what he said about the cannonball. Well, a few days later, to show you how absurd things were, way back in 1798, a few days later, a newspaper in New York by the name of the New York Argus published an editorial. Now, the New York Argus were Jeffersonians. They were against what John Adams was doing. And so in their editorial, they said, you know, this is really absurd. They arrest this drunk in Newark because he says he wants to fire a cannonball at John Adams' ass. How could that possibly be considered a danger? Why, the ass of John Adams is far too disgusting a target for anyone to look at long enough to fire a cannonball at it. And guess what? The feds came after the New York Argus because they were being disrespectful of the president. And of course, that's a funny story, but it was nonetheless extremely serious because 7 years after the First Amendment becomes the supreme law of the land, it is sat upon and nearly suffocated by John Adams' ass. I don't mean John Adams' literal ass. I don't know for a fact, but I'll accept the New York Argus's point of view that that's far too disgusting a target to even talk about. But what I am referring to is the spoken word ass and the written word ass. That's what was causing all the controversy. In other words, speech and press. The very two things that the First Amendment said Congress shall make no law abridging. Thomas Jefferson was so livid when he found out about that he told his friends that he was thinking of advising Virginia and other states to secede from the new Union. This would have been a civil war 60 years earlier, and it would have destroyed our country. And it was really a critical moment in which the whole future of the United States depended. That whole future hinged on that ass. And you can sort of imagine, if you think about the great people in history, people like Socrates, who was sentenced to death by the Athenian democracy because he wouldn't shut up. The world's first democracy kills what many people consider the greatest philosopher in history simply because he talked too much. Or John Milton, as I mentioned. I mean, if they were looking in on this, they were hoping that something could be done to stop this insanity in the United States. But if we're looking at eternity, there were people on the other side as well. And in the 20th century, people like Adolf Hitler and his minister for propaganda and popular enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, who got his PhD from the University of Heidelberg in 1922, understood communications. Those folks would have been right there with John Adams, hoping that the First Amendment was trampled and destroyed. Well, Jefferson, after thinking it over, decided to stay the course and, in fact, to run for president in the election of 1800 against John Adams. And in an interesting, fascinating development in history, Adams was soundly defeated, but Jefferson and Aaron Burr were pretty much neck and neck in the Electoral College. Does that sound familiar? It went into the House of Representatives, and Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States.